The cemetery was eerily quiet that afternoon, its silence only broken by the rustling of bare branches as the wind whipped through them. It was a cold day, the kind that seemed to wrap itself around you, not just in the air but in your bones. Marshall Whitmore stood alone, a man hardened by years of power and success, but now reduced to a shadow of himself. His once imposing frame, cloaked in a designer trench coat, seemed smaller somehow as he stared down at the grave before him. Asterisk Caleb Whitmore. Beloved son. Asterisk the stone seemed so simple for a boy who should have had everything except time. The letters were etched in bold black, stark against the marble, and yet they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. It had been 5 years since Caleb had died in that crash, the kind of crash that never made the papers, the kind that was too common to warrant more than a few sympathetic remarks. A drunk driver on a slick highway. That's all they said. Marshall hadn't cried in years. He hadn't allowed himself to. Grief, to him, was a weakness, something to be buried beneath his ambition, beneath the empire he had built. He had the world's most advanced tech, the largest portfolios, the most power in the business world. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered without Caleb. There was no joy in his life anymore. No warmth. Caleb had been everything to him. And now he was just a name on a stone. His hands trembled, despite the thick gloves, as he placed a bouquet of white lilies, Caleb's favorite flowers, onto the grave. His heart clenched as he whispered a silent apology into the wind. Asterisk I wasn't there. I couldn't save you. Asterisk. A faint sound broke through the stillness. A sniffle. Marshall's head jerked up, his eyes scanning the graveyard. The wind howled around him, masking most sounds. But there it was again, the soft sound of someone trying to hide their presence. A sniffle, barely audible. He took a step back, scanning the area with more urgency. Was it the wind playing tricks? Or had someone followed him here? His heart pounded in his chest as he moved closer to Caleb's headstone, half expecting to see a figure darting away. But when his eyes fell upon the edge of the grave, a small figure caught his attention. There, half concealed behind a scraggly bush, was a little girl. Her coat was torn and barely clung to her slight frame. The hem of her dress was ragged, and her bare feet, dirty and bruised, poked out from beneath the fabric, toes trembling against the cold. Her pale face, framed by tangled blonde hair, looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks, if not longer. Her cheeks were raw, wind-burned, her eyes wide with fear. Marshall's heart stopped. He wasn't sure if it was the shock of her sudden appearance or the strangeness of the situation. Who was she? And why was she here of all places? He took a step toward her, his voice low and careful, trying to mask the sudden surge of emotion. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, as if startled by it. She looked at him, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion, as though she didn't believe she was really being spoken to. She hugged her thin arms tightly to her chest, almost as if trying to make herself invisible. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to be here when you came. Please don't make me leave. Marshall's chest tightened. Something in her voice cut through him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a sadness in her words. It was the way she seemed so fragile, so utterly alone. He knelt down to her level, tried to keep his voice calm, despite the strange knot in his stomach. You're not in trouble, he said softly, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he reached out to her. But this place isn't safe in this weather. Where are your parents? The girl didn't answer right away. She looked away from him, her eyes darting around, as if she were trying to find an escape route. The wind howled louder, the trees creaking overhead, but there was no other sound except for her soft breathing. My mom, she got sick, she said finally, the words tumbling out as if there was something she hadn't wanted to speak, but had to. She went asleep and didn't wake up. My dad, he left after he said he couldn't do it anymore. Marshall's heart clenched in his chest. He couldn't fathom how someone so young could be carrying such a heavy burden. She was just a little girl. How long have you been alone? He asked quietly. She sniffled, wiping her nose on the back of her hand, but didn't answer right away. Where are you staying? Marshall pressed. He had no more. This girl was out here in the cold, alone. How had she gotten here? She shrugged her shoulders, a small motion, as if it didn't matter anymore. I sleep behind an old church bus, she said. It's not so bad when it rains. I curl up under the seats. It's warm there. Marshall stood, his mind spinning. A million thoughts rushed through his head, each more unsettling than the last. This child, standing before him, was barely clothed, no shoes to keep her warm. And yet she was here, in a cemetery of all places, on the anniversary of his son's death. But then something strange hit him. She had said something when she spoke, something that made the blood in his veins run cold. I knew Caleb, she said, looking up at him now, her voice cracking with emotion. He was my only friend. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. The words hit Marshall like a freight train. His breath caught in his throat. She knew Caleb, the little girl, this homeless stranger, knew his son? He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process this. You knew my son? He asked, his voice hoarse, as the world around him seemed to fall into a strange, echoing silence. How? The girl nodded slowly, her eyes sad, her voice shaking. He was my friend. He said I should come find you. If anything happened to him. Marshall's heart raced as her words echoed in his mind. What was she talking about? How did she know Caleb? And why had he never mentioned her? The wind howled around them, louder now. Marshall's mind was spinning, trying to grasp what was happening. But one thing was clear. Caleb's life and death hadn't been as simple as the world had told him. And this girl, this mysterious stranger, held a key he hadn't expected. What's your name? He asked, his voice quieter now, more focused. Sophie, she said. Sophie Grant. Marshall's thoughts were a blur, but one thing was certain. His world was about to change forever. Marshall felt the weight of her words. I knew Caleb. They hung in the air, thick with unspoken questions. For a moment he couldn't move. His heart pounded in his chest, and a sharp edge of panic slid through him. How could this girl have known Caleb? He had never heard of her, not once. His son, in all his journals and school reports, had never mentioned a Sophie Grant. Yet here she was, standing in front of him, a ghost from Caleb's life he had never known existed. His mind reeled, his thoughts racing, but there was one thing he had to do. He had to bring this girl inside. The cold was unbearable, the wind biting through every layer of his coat. He couldn't leave her here alone, especially not when she spoke with such quiet desperation. And the look in her eyes, the vulnerability, the raw fear, sent a wave of protective instinct surging through him. Without another word, Marshall gently placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the gates of the cemetery. She hesitated, looking back at Caleb's grave one last time, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Regret? Hope? It was as if she were saying goodbye to a piece of her past, something she'd carried with her all this time. Once they were outside the cemetery's iron gates, Marshall led Sophie to the car, his mind still buzzing with questions. He didn't ask her to explain, not yet. There was time for that later. Right now, she needed warmth, safety. The drive back to the Whitmore estate was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft sniffles from the back seat. Marshall kept glancing at her through the rear-view mirror. Her eyes were wide, not with fear this time, but with disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe that she was in the car with him, that she was leaving the cemetery, that she was no longer alone. When they arrived at the estate, Marshall led Sophie inside. Keep his tone gentle, try to ease the tension in the air. The mansion was vast, too large for just one person, but now it seemed almost oppressive in its emptiness. He wondered what it must feel like for Sophie, walking into this massive house that didn't belong to her. But she didn't seem afraid, just cautious, like a wild animal that wasn't sure if it could trust a hand reaching out to it. Marshall took her to the guest bedroom, where he wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and left her with a mug of hot cocoa, feeling like he was doing too little, too late. But at least it was something. As she sipped quietly, he stood by the door, uncertain of what to do next. How could a man like him, someone who had built an empire, someone who had weathered countless storms in business, feel so out of his depth in this moment? Sophie, he started, his voice softer than he intended. You said you knew Caleb. How? Why didn't you ever tell me about you? Her eyes darted to the floor as if the question made her uncomfortable. She hugged the blanket tighter around her small shoulders and took a shaky breath before responding. We met at the park, she began slowly, her voice small but steady. He used to bring me food sometimes. Sandwiches, juice. He would sit with me and talk. He told me I mattered, that I wasn't invisible. I never had anyone like that before. Marshall felt something heavy settle in his chest. Caleb, his son, the boy who had been so sheltered in his world of privilege, had reached out to this little girl when no one else had. It was hard for Marshall to imagine. But as Sophie spoke, it painted a picture of his son that was nothing like he had known. And Caleb, Sophie continued, eyes unfocused as if she were lost in the memory. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. He said you would help me, that you would keep your promises. Her words hit Marshall like a freight train, and for a long moment he couldn't respond. His son, dead for 5 years, had made a promise to this girl, a promise to look out for her. And now, in his absence, Marshall was standing here, listening to her recount that promise like it was the most important thing Caleb had ever done. A promise. That thought kept circling in Marshall's mind. Caleb had known. He'd known something was coming. He had made arrangements, reached out to someone who was so far removed from his world. Someone he hadn't even spoken of. Marshall swallowed hard, trying to hold his emotions in check. He believed in me, he murmured, more to himself than to Sophie. He believed I would protect you. Sophie nodded, though her gaze remained distant. He always said you'd do the right thing. For the first time in years, Marshall felt a tear well up in his eye, but he forced it back. He couldn't break down now, not with Sophie here. She needed him to be strong. I'll keep that promise, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I will take care of you, Sophie. No one will hurt you again. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with something close to hope, something she hadn't shown since he met her. It was the smallest of smiles, but it made his heart ache. Later that evening, after Sophie had settled into the guest bedroom, Marshall found himself alone in his study, staring at his son's photograph on his desk. It had been so long since he allowed himself to think about Caleb. Really think about him. He had spent the years after Caleb's death buried in work, trying to bury the guilt, the shame. He had never been there for Caleb, in the way a father should be. He had failed him. But now, Caleb's voice, his promise, echoed in Marshall's mind. Sophie needed him. And somehow, Caleb had known that. He had known that this girl, this homeless, broken little girl, would come to him. Marshall didn't know what had happened to Caleb. Not yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a random encounter. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. And with each passing hour, Marshall found himself drawn deeper into the mystery that had lingered, untouched, for too long. What had Caleb known? And what was he trying to protect Sophie from? Marshall's eyes narrowed with determination. Whatever the truth was, he was going to uncover it. For Caleb, for Sophie. The morning came slowly, like a quiet breath after a long, troubled night. Marshall had barely slept, his mind racing through the events of the previous day. Sophie was safe now, under his roof, but that only made the questions more urgent. Why hadn't Caleb told him about her? How had she known Caleb so well? And why had she come to him with that cryptic message? And most of all, what had Caleb known that Marshall hadn't? Marshall's thoughts were interrupted by the soft tap of footsteps on the marble floor. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair mussed from sleep, her eyes still heavy. She was holding something in her hands, a crumpled piece of paper. "Good morning," Marshall said, his voice gentle but tinged with the uncertainty he felt. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked over to the desk where Caleb's photograph sat, placing the paper carefully beside it. "I found this," she whispered. "It was in Caleb's jacket. He told me to keep it safe." Marshall reached for the paper, his heart pounding. He could tell by the shaky handwriting that it was Caleb's. The words were incomplete, but they were enough to stop him in his tracks. "Asterisk if something happens to me. Promise me you'll look after Sophie. She's been through more than anyone knows. Please, Dad, don't let her disappear too. Asterisk." Marshall's hands trembled as he read again, the weight of those words sinking into him like a stone in water. Caleb had known. He had known something was coming. But what? Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. He told me not to tell anyone about the note. But I don't know what else to do. I don't understand why he left it, or why he wanted you to keep it. He knew you would help me. Marshall swallowed hard. He believed in me, he said softly, more to himself than to Sophie. He cleared his throat, focusing on the note. Caleb's handwriting was as familiar to him as his own, but seeing these words, knowing his son had written them, it was almost too much to bear. You did the right thing by giving it to me, Marshall told Sophie, his voice firm but kind. Now, I need to understand everything Caleb was trying to tell me. There are things I don't know, things I need to find out. Sophie nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry. Do you think Caleb will be mad at me for telling you everything? No, Marshall said, his voice filled with conviction. He would never be mad at you. He trusted you, Sophie, and he trusted me. He knew I would keep my promises. Sophie's face softened at his words. It was the first time he had seen her smile without hesitation. Okay, she whispered, before looking down at her hands. Marshall stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the vast grounds of the Whitmore estate. His mind was already racing ahead, piecing things together. Caleb had been an incredible boy. Marshall had always known he was smart, compassionate, but he hadn't realized just how deep that compassion ran. He had kept this girl, this stranger, in his life when no one else had. It was clear that something had been wrong the day Caleb died. There were too many holes in the story, too many unanswered questions. He needed to dig deeper to get to the truth, for Caleb and for Sophie. After a quick breakfast, Marshall made a call to a private investigator. He was determined to find out everything he could about the day Caleb had died. The official report had been clear. Caleb was walking home from soccer practice when a drunk driver struck him on a rain-slicked road. It had been a tragic accident. No one could deny that. But Sophie's words, the mention of a secret, the argument she had overheard between Caleb and Tyler, it all pointed to something more. Marshall wasn't ready to accept the easy answer. He needed to know the truth. As he hung up the phone, Marshall turned to Sophie, who had been sitting quietly by the fire. I'm going to find out what really happened that day, Sophie, he said firmly. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll take care of it. Sophie met his gaze, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but a glimmer of hope flickered in them. What if it's too late? Marshall shook his head, his jaw clenched with resolve. It's never too late. Later that afternoon, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. A man in his 40s stood on the threshold, his expression unreadable. He was tall, with short-cropped hair and a quiet intensity that matched his sharp suit. He introduced himself as Detective Vargas, a longtime friend of Marshall's. I hear you got some questions about your son's death, Vargas said, his voice low but steady. Marshall invited him inside, leading him to the study. As they sat, Marshall placed Caleb's note in front of Vargas. I'm reopening the investigation, Marshall said bluntly. I need to know the truth about what happened to Caleb. I don't care about the headlines. I don't care about the official report. I want the real story. Vargas took the note, examining it carefully before glancing up at Marshall. I understand. You know, I've always had my doubts about the case. The accident seemed too clean, too perfect. But I never had the proof to back it up. Marshall's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Vargas leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. There's always something off about accidents like this. A lot of times, the victim is unaware of what's coming, but Caleb, he was a bright kid, a good kid. He wouldn't have been walking alone on a rainy night if there hadn't been some kind of trouble. And there's the matter of his friend, Tyler Hayes. Marshall's breath caught at the mention of Tyler. Sophie had said Caleb and Tyler had fought, and now Vargas was suggesting there was something more to their relationship than just friendship. I need to know everything you have on Tyler, Marshall said, his voice tightening. And I need you to dig into his father, Gregory Hayes. Whatever Caleb found out, it had to do with him. Vargas nodded. I'll dig into it. It might take a few days, but I'll get you answers. Marshall's gaze hardened. Good. Because I won't rest until I know the truth. As the evening drew near, Marshall found himself in Caleb's room again. Sophie had spent most of the day with him, quietly exploring the house, but now she had retreated to the guest room, likely overwhelmed by the events of the last few days. Marshall stood by the window, looking out over the vast grounds of the estate. He could feel Caleb's presence in this room, almost as if the boy were still here, watching over them. Marshall's hand clenched into a fist at his side. There was so much more to this story than anyone had let on, and he was going to uncover it. For Caleb and for Sophie. No matter what it took. The days seemed to stretch longer as Marshall waited for answers. Each morning, he would look at Caleb's photograph on his desk, wondering how many more secrets his son had left behind. It wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about honoring Caleb's legacy and understanding the depth of his compassion for someone like Sophie. Marshall had never realized how much his son had done for others, how much he protected them, even in death. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Whitmore estate, Marshall paced the study, his mind running through every possible theory. Tyler Hayes was at the center of it all. Everything pointed to him. But what had Caleb discovered that made him so determined to protect Sophie? What had he known about Tyler's family, about Gregory Hayes, that made him feel this sense of urgency? Marshall's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was Detective Vargas. Marshall. Vargas's voice was heavy, like he had news he didn't want to deliver. "I've got something. It's not good." Marshall's heart sank. He held his breath. "What did you find?" "I've been digging into Tyler Hayes, and I found something that doesn't sit right," Vargas continued. "Tyler's father, Gregory Hayes. He's connected to a construction company that's been involved in multiple unsafe projects. Caleb found some major structural flaws in a local school while volunteering. He was planning to report it. And then," Vargas paused, "and then he died." Marshall finished the sentence, his voice barely a whisper. Vargas sighed. "Yeah, and what's worse, it turns out that Gregory Hayes had a personal stake in covering it up. He didn't want those flaws reported. It would have ruined him financially. But Caleb, being Caleb, wouldn't let it go. He was ready to take the whole thing public." Marshall's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fit together. Caleb had been more than just a good kid. He had been a whistleblower, someone willing to stand up for what was right, even if it meant going against his closest friends. "And Tyler?" Marshall asked, his voice tight with anger. Tyler was involved. He wasn't just upset that Caleb was going to report his father's company. He was terrified of what it would mean for his family. For his father, Vargas explained. That's why they fought. Caleb was pushing to tell the truth, but Tyler didn't want to lose his father's approval. So they argued, and Caleb walked away. But Tyler followed him, trying to convince him to drop it. That's when things went wrong. Tyler pushed Caleb in frustration. Caleb stumbled into the street, and that's when the car hit him. Marshall's chest tightened with a combination of grief and fury. So it was an accident? Tyler didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't intentional, but it wasn't a pure accident either, Vargas said. Tyler's actions, pushing Caleb, led to his death. He was angry, desperate, and it all ended with Caleb being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marshall's mind raced. And what about his father? What's his role in this? "I'm still looking into it," Vargas replied. "But I can tell you one thing. Gregory Hayes will stop at nothing to protect himself. He's already tried to bury this story once, and I'm sure he'll do everything he can to keep the truth from coming out." Marshall took a deep breath, his mind processing everything Vargas had said. "I want everything. Every detail you can find on Tyler, Gregory, and their connection to Caleb's death. I don't care how long it takes. I want the truth." "I'll keep you updated," Vargas said. "This isn't over yet." Marshall ended the call, his thoughts swirling in a haze of anger and grief. His son had been so much more than he had realized. Caleb had been trying to expose corruption, protect the people who had no voice, and in doing so, he had put himself in danger. The fact that his son had tried to do the right thing and had died for it was almost too much to bear, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Caleb had left him a message, a promise, and Marshall wasn't about to break it. He sat down at his desk, staring at Caleb's note once more. "Please, Dad, don't let her disappear too. Sophie, the girl who had been a part of Caleb's life in ways Marshall couldn't even fathom. The girl who Caleb had trusted." Marshall's resolve hardened. If Tyler and his father had been involved in Caleb's death, he was going to make them pay for it. But more than that, he was going to keep Sophie safe. Caleb's promise to protect her had become his own. The next morning, Marshall went to see Sophie. She was sitting by the window in the den, gazing out at the snow-covered garden. She was silent, lost in her thoughts. He walked up behind her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "I need you to know something, Sophie," he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Your brother, Caleb," Marshall continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He was a hero. He was trying to protect you. He did everything he could to make sure you were safe. And I'm going to make sure that his death wasn't in vain. I'm going to find out the truth about what happened to him." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. Do you think Tyler is the reason Caleb is gone?" Marshall nodded. "Yes, but it was a mistake, a tragic mistake. And I'm going to make sure it's righted. For Caleb and for you." She nodded slowly, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I just want him back." Marshall's heart ached for her. He pulled her into a gentle hug. "I know, Sophie. I know." As he held her, Marshall realized something. This was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for redemption, for closure, and for the legacy Caleb had left behind. Marshall wasn't just trying to uncover the truth. He was trying to honor his son's memory, to make sure that the world would know who Caleb really was. And no matter what it took, Marshall Whitmore would bring the truth to light. The days blurred together as Marshall plunged deeper into the investigation. Every morning, he'd stand in front of Caleb's picture and promise to uncover the truth. Every night, he would stare out the window, haunted by the thought of what his son had gone through. Caleb had been determined to expose the truth about Gregory Hayes and his corrupt construction company, but he'd never lived long enough to see it through. Marshall couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. The more he learned, the darker the picture became. Tyler Hayes might not have meant to kill Caleb, but his actions had set a chain of events in motion that led to his son's tragic death. And yet, it wasn't just Tyler he had to worry about. It was Gregory Hayes, a man who would stop at nothing to protect himself and his empire. The private investigator had uncovered more than he'd expected. He had found records of unsafe building practices, structural flaws hidden in plain sight, and internal emails that suggested the Hayes family had been working to cover up these issues for years. But there was one detail that stood out. Caleb had been the one to stumble across it, not just by accident, but through his own efforts. He had found something bigger, something more dangerous than anyone could have known. Marshall's thoughts were interrupted by a call from Detective Vargas. "Marshall." Vargas's voice was heavy. "I've got something. You need to sit down for this." Marshall's stomach tightened as he sat down in his study chair, his pulse quickening. "What did you find?" "Remember how we thought Tyler might have been the only one involved in Caleb's death? Well, I dug deeper into Gregory Hayes. I found something you won't like." Marshall closed his eyes, his heart sinking. "What is it?" Vargas's voice dropped lower. Gregory Hayes didn't just know about the structural flaws Caleb had uncovered. He knew Caleb was getting closer to exposing the truth. He was in damage control mode, and Tyler was just the beginning. Marshall stood up, his mind racing. "What are you saying?" "There's evidence that Gregory Hayes tried to bribe Caleb. He offered him money to drop the investigation, but Caleb refused. He wasn't for sale," Vargas explained. "I also found a witness who said they overheard Gregory and Tyler arguing the night Caleb died. According to this witness, Gregory was furious with Tyler for letting Caleb get away." Marshall's blood ran cold. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Gregory Hayes hadn't just been trying to protect his business. He'd been trying to protect himself and his son by making sure Caleb never got the chance to report what he found. "Do you have the witness statement?" Marshall asked, his voice cold with anger. "Yeah, I do. It's with my team. We're going to press charges against both Gregory and Tyler," Vargas said, his tone resolute. I'm not letting this slide, Marshall. You're not alone in this. Marshall felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He had known the truth was out there, but hearing it from someone he trusted made it feel more real, more tangible. He had a chance to bring justice for Caleb, for Sophie, and for himself. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Marshall said, his voice unwavering. "We need to make sure this doesn't go any further. I'm not letting them get away with this." Later that day, Marshall and Vargas met at the courthouse, their faces set with determination. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Marshall had never been a man to fight in courtrooms, but for Caleb, for Sophie, he would do whatever it took. The witness statement Vargas had gathered was damning. The argument between Gregory and Tyler Hayes had been overheard by someone who had been walking by the Hayes estate. The witness claimed they had heard Gregory shouting at Tyler, accusing him of failing to stop Caleb from exposing the truth. Tyler had tried to defend himself, but the argument quickly turned into a shouting match. The witness had said they heard Gregory threaten Tyler, telling him that if Caleb's investigation didn't end, the family would be ruined. Marshall couldn't stop the growing sense of disbelief. All this time, he had thought it was an accident, but now, it was clear that Caleb's death had been part of a much larger story, a story of corruption, desperation, and a father willing to sacrifice anything to protect his family's reputation. The trial had already begun, and Marshall was present every step of the way. As the days passed, more witnesses came forward, corroborating the evidence Vargas had gathered. The truth was coming to light, and Tyler was not the only one on trial. It was a brutal, emotional process. Each witness, each piece of evidence, seemed to hammer away at the image of family that Marshall had once trusted. But as the trial neared its conclusion, something unexpected happened. Tyler took the stand. Marshall hadn't expected to hear from him directly. He'd been a reluctant participant in the investigation, but now, standing in front of the courtroom, he seemed smaller, more fragile than Marshall had imagined. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "I never meant for him to die," Tyler said, his voice shaking. "I pushed him. I shouldn't have. But I didn't want him to ruin everything for my dad. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Marshall's heart ached at the confession. But there was something else, something that didn't sit right. Tyler wasn't just scared of his father's wrath. He was terrified of the consequences of his actions. He wasn't just scared of his father, Marshall whispered to Vargas, who stood beside him. He was scared of what he'd done. Vargas nodded grimly. He didn't kill Caleb on purpose, but his actions led to it. And now, it's time for him to take responsibility for it. The trial stretched on for weeks, but in the end, the truth prevailed. Both Gregory and Tyler Hayes were charged with manslaughter, and the evidence was irrefutable. Tyler had never intended to kill Caleb, but his actions, his fear, his desperation, had led to a tragedy that would haunt them all. Marshall had never felt a sense of closure, not in the way he thought he would. There was no triumphant victory, no satisfaction in seeing justice done. Instead, there was only the hollow ache of loss and the weight of a promise kept. After the trial, Marshall returned to the mansion. Sophie was waiting for him in the den, her eyes searching his face for answers. She didn't ask any questions, not yet, but Marshall could see the uncertainty in her gaze. He sat down beside her, the silence between them comfortable, but filled with unspoken words. "It's over," he said quietly. She nodded, her expression softening. "Is it?" Marshall looked at her, a pang of guilt squeezing his chest. He had tried to give her the world, but in the end, there would always be something missing. Caleb was gone, and nothing would ever bring him back. But Sophie had been Caleb's final act of kindness, and Marshall would honor that with every breath in his body. For the first time in weeks, he smiled, though it was a sad smile. "We'll be okay. I promise." The days after the trial were quieter, but still an unspoken tension lingered. The truth about Caleb's death had been laid bare, but there was no celebration, no joy in the victory. Justice had been served, but it felt like an empty gesture in the grand scheme of things. Caleb was still gone, and the world would never be the same without him. Marshall spent a lot of time in Caleb's old room, lingering by the window where his son used to gaze out at the stars. The telescope was still there, the same one Caleb had used to search for constellations on clear nights. He found comfort in the familiarity, but it also left him with an overwhelming sense of loss. Sophie, too, was finding her place in the mansion. She had her own room now, decorated with the few possessions she had brought with her when Marshall took her in. It wasn't much, but to her it was everything, and she was slowly beginning to heal, though her memories of the past still haunted her. One night, after dinner, Marshall found Sophie in the garden, standing by the new rose bush they had planted in Caleb's memory. The wind was gentle, the scent of the roses filling the air. Sophie was silent as she looked up at the stars, the same stars Caleb had loved so much. Marshall walked up to her, his footsteps soft on the grass. He had something important to say, but the words felt heavy, like they might crush him if he spoke them. "You know," he began, his voice low, "Caleb would have wanted you to be happy. He wanted you to have a chance at life." Sophie turned to him, her face a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know. Sometimes I think about how much I miss him. I think about how unfair it all is." Marshall nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Life is unfair, but you've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing. You've given me a chance to try again, a chance to live. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with so many questions. What if I don't know how to live without him? Marshall gently took her hand, his grip strong and steady. "I don't know how either, but we're going to figure it out together, one day at a time." Sophie smiled weakly, then wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug. The warmth of her embrace was a balm to his battered soul. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither was she. They had both lost so much, but they had also found something they could hold on to, each other. The next few months passed in a blur of small changes, small moments of progress. Marshall started attending counseling, something he'd been avoiding for years. He'd never allowed himself to grieve fully, never given himself the space to fall apart. But now, with Sophie in his life, he had no choice but to face the broken pieces of himself. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to heal. Sophie thrived in her new life. She threw herself into her studies, something she hadn't had the opportunity to do before. She joined a local soccer team, something Caleb would have been proud of. Marshall, despite his initial resistance, supported her every step of the way. They spent weekends together, playing games, cooking dinner, and talking late into the night about Caleb and the dreams they still held. One day, as they sat on the porch, Marshall glanced at Sophie, who was flipping through a book she'd been reading for school. "You know," Marshall said, his voice filled with quiet pride, "I think Caleb would have loved seeing you like this. He'd be proud." Sophie smiled softly, looking up from her book. "I think so, too. But I think he'd be proud of you, too, Dad. You kept your promise." Marshall's throat tightened at the words. He'd promised Caleb he would take care of Sophie, and he had kept that promise, not just out of obligation, but because he truly cared for her. She had become the light in his life, just as Caleb had once been. Months later, on what would have been Caleb's 18th birthday, Marshall stood in front of Caleb's grave, Sophie by his side. The winds had died down, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. The rose bush they had planted in Caleb's memory was thriving, its blooms vibrant and full of life. "Happy birthday, Caleb," Marshall whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think I could ever live without you, but I'm trying, for you and for Sophie." Sophie knelt beside him, placing a single white rose on the grave. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered softly. "I'll never forget you. You saved me." Marshall's chest tightened as he watched her. She was finally beginning to heal, to find her place in the world. And in that moment, he realized that Caleb's death had been a catalyst for something greater, a new beginning for both of them. The wind picked up again, but this time it wasn't a gust of grief or loss. It was a gentle breeze, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Marshall stood, his hand resting gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Let's go home, kiddo." Together. They walked back to the car, their footsteps in sync, the weight of their shared past and uncertain future no longer a burden, but a reminder of what they had gained. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together, and that was all that mattered.